Thank you all. It's really awesome to be here. Oof. It's a real thrill for me to be here. It was just in a room of just accomplished individuals, leaders, future leaders, not just in emergency medicine, but in medicine, maybe the world and maybe the universe. So thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here. It's a late Friday night in a city ER, and Jill L. is a young ER doc's nicest patient. She's also the sharpest dressed and the best smelling person in the entire place, and that includes the staff. And yet, the young ER doc is frustrated. Her story is vague. It loops and drifts and takes detours, and now he's lost and he can feel the tension creep into his neck. Wait, he thinks. Did she just say chest pain? Couldn't catch her breath? She did. So he chases a possible heart attack. It's unlikely, mid-30s, no cardiac risk factors. What if a blood clot shot to her lung? So the workup stretches through the night, and Jill L. doesn't complain. When daylight comes and all the tests fail to explain her symptoms, she's grateful for his efforts. The young ER doc is kind, diligent, and devoid of any imagination. What he doesn't think is why. Why did this woman change her obvious evening plans to come to the this ER, at this time of night, for what sounds like vague concerns when there's absolutely nothing vague about her? If he was curious and he just asked, she might have opened up and told him the real reason why she had to be here hours earlier, before all the testing. She was being abused physically and emotionally by her husband, and she finally had enough. The doc who felt compelled to find an answer rather than probe the uncertainty in her story was the young me at the start of my medical career. I was well trained to identify and treat acutely ill and injured patients. Unfortunately, my patients didn't always read the same textbooks and journal articles that I did. Their symptoms didn't always point to a disease. Their medical woes were tangled up with a hornet's nest of social issues. Their stories weren't nuts waiting to be cracked, but messy first drafts. I received less training in what might be the central challenge of my emergency medicine practice, navigating uncertainty, which is incredible, really, because uncertainty is everywhere in medicine, from diagnosis and prognosis to communication and history taking. And uncertainty doesn't feel good. For me, it feels like a mild allergic reaction. I get like itchy and twitchy and sweaty, a little bit wheezy. And my first impulse is to get rid of it, and I reach for more data, which usually means more diagnostic testing. But as we saw with Jill L., more data doesn't promise more certainty. So how did I become more comfortable with uncertainty? I found myself borrowing a set of skills from my other life as a creative writer. It may sound counterintuitive, but for me, the remedy for uncertainty was more not knowing, a particular type of not knowing described by the writer John Barthelme in his essay of the same name. In the essay, he described the writer as someone who, when embarking upon a task, doesn't know what to do. Writing and the creative arts in general is a process of dealing with not knowing. What do I need to do, and how do I go about doing it? Problems are absolutely crucial to not knowing, and not knowing is crucial to art. Without problems and the possibility of moving the mind in unanticipated directions, there will be no invention. So we must embrace problems. Barthelme wrote how the seriousness of an artist is defined by the seriousness of the problems that she or he takes into account. With Jill L., I was stuck. Sadly, at that time, I didn't view being stuck as an opportunity, but as a failure. But through the lens of not knowing it's okay to be stuck. In fact, being stuck might be the only clue that you're onto something, that it's time to stop, think differently, and probe deeper. I believe, ultimately, Jill L. took pity on me. Right before discharge, she made a passing comment about not wanting to call her husband. Basically, she swung the door wide open, and all I had to do was curl into a ball of shame and roll on in. Not knowing changed the way I listened to patients. Their stories weren't instruments for problem solving, but for problem finding, borrowing words from a narrative scholar who wrote how stories are deeply about plight, about the road rather than the end to which it leads. A medical history is not the same as a patient's story. The most exhaustive description of symptoms can still miss the key problems plaguing a particular patient at a particular moment in their lives. Not knowing made me acutely aware of the vulnerability involved in telling stories, especially in the emergency department, where scared, frightened, and nervous, anxious patients must reveal intimate details to a total stranger in a white coat. Which is why it's a rare ER shift when I'm not reminded of these words from the actor and playwright Anna Devere Smith. We can learn a lot about a person in the very moment that language fails them. Looking back, I recognize that much of my conversation with Jill L. was subtext, and I wasn't paying attention to what was between the lines, the gaps in her story. Not only didn't I know where to look, I wasn't even savvy enough to recognize I had to look. I want to be clear on a few points. Not knowing shouldn't be confused with ignorance. It's not lack of knowledge or poor application of knowledge. Not knowing begins with a solid foundation of medical knowledge. Without that, it's hard to know what we don't know. Not knowing is a muscle, and with it, I have a better chance of accessing those parts of a patient's story that are rich with the unsaid and the unsayable, the not known and, yes, the not knowable. Which is to say, a call for not knowing is a call for more imagination in medicine. This is not a touch of fancy, for the lack of imagination can lead to medical error. Overconfidence has been described as a failure of the imagination. If we can't imagine alternatives to our beliefs and other ways of seeing, we will be convinced that our beliefs and our opinions are true. What needs to be done? We must normalize uncertainty in medicine. This means having honest discussions with our patients about what we know and what we don't. This is hard. Patients, families, and society expect us to have answers. We must cultivate not knowing in medical training, even reward it. To not know is not synonymous with being wrong. In fact, it takes a measure of courage to sit in uncertainty with our patients. We talk a lot about the importance of shared decision-making, but that involves shared uncertainty. We must focus on process, mapping our thinking process as we're making decisions, starting with the decisions we make even before we think we're making decisions. For example, why do we choose certain details in a patient's story to focus on, like chest pain and shortness of breath in Jill L's case, and not others? The story I created about Jill L was very different from the one that she was telling me. Sure, the cognitive science literature shows that our brains will take any information that's available to it and will make a story, and it doesn't bother with details it doesn't have. Unfortunately, but forcing Jill L or any of our patients into the wrong story is a narrative error with grave medical consequences. But we must take risks. Not knowing involves risk-taking, and medicine is not very good at taking risks. But there are people we can turn to who are experts at this type of risk-taking, artists. And to this end, we must make a seat for writers, artists, and designers in healthcare teams and in medical education. What Bartholomew wrote about the purposes of art speaks to our work in medicine. Art is a true account of the activity of the mind. Art thinks ever of the world, and art's project, ultimately, is to better the world. If I become a wiser physician over the course of my career, and that's a big if, it's not from knowing more answers, but from not knowing being more comfortable with uncertainty and asking better questions. Jill L. and all our patients deserve physicians who are evidence-using and creative-minded, because the best medicine doesn't work on the wrong story. Thank you very much.